Hey folks, I am just headed home from the office here. It's a long day. We're gonna go to Reddit, and this question's pretty simple. It's a pretty short one. I don't know if I can call it simple. It's short, and this is from CS Career Questions. And I would just like to remind people that if you find that my conversations, the things I discussed from Reddit are helpful, if you'd like to share them back to the subreddit that they're on, and specifically the post, that would be cool. Because I don't want to be self-promoting, get banned, but if you think it's helpful to part of the conversation, that's cool. This one's titled, "Is it normal if your manager is asking ETA for research tasks as well?" And then the person goes on to say, I mean, how can you quote a time if you're learning and implementing that technology for the first time? Let me know if you've also seen the same in your organization. Thanks. So I think it's a helpful one to talk through. It might not be super common, or it might not seem like it is something that you're doing a lot of, but I don't know. I think that this kind of stuff does come up for arguably like every developer at some point. So I think it'd be kind of helpful to chat through it, maybe give some perspective on why people ask this kind of thing, like as from a manager, even a project manager perspective, right? Let's address some of the, kind of defend this person's stance. Based on the way they've written it, it kind of seems like, hey, this feels uncomfortable to be prodded on this kind of stuff, and I think understandably so. So let's chat through it, see what's up. Friendly reminder that if you want questions answered, leave them in the comments. I'll do my best to answer them, and or you can message Dev Leader on social media. It's also my main YouTube channel with more polished, edited videos, resume reviews, which I've been kicking up a notch. And if you message me directly, I will keep you anonymous. So that way, I don't know, you can add a little bit more context for whatever you'd like me to discuss. So, with that said, I do have experience with this as a manager, and kind of like I don't know if I can say as the engineer as well, if I mean it from the perspective of my own team that I was managing. It's a little backwards, I guess, but the context is that before Microsoft, I was working at a digital forensics company, and my team did a lot of prototyping. And so not only do prototypes kind of put you into a very similar boat, because get a prototype and you're like, we don't even know what we're building or what this technology is. Like, it's a lot of kind of research, right? Like not necessarily traditional research, like you're conducting experiments or something like that, but like you're playing around with technology, trying to sort things out, or trying to get business questions answered so that you can make decisions after. So not only do we have that, but my team was also responsible for a mobile acquisition product. And for mobile acquisition in sort of like forensic domain, the ideal goal, right, is that you, and I guess if I back up a notch, in digital forensics, when we're talking about like hard drives, right, like what people would be doing for computer forensics is that ideally you get a byte for byte copy of the hard drive that you're dealing with, right? If you have a byte for byte copy, then you can take a hammer to the original hard disk and you're good, because you have a byte for byte copy. No matter what kind of software or tools you're using, there's no risk, because you're just no risk to the original evidence, because you're dealing literally with a copy. So having a copy byte for byte is like the best spot to be in. Okay. The challenge is that with mobile forensics compared to like a computer, is that with a computer, you can take the hard drive out. You don't need to boot off the hard disk. But with a phone, like the drive where the data is inside the phone. So when you need to do mobile forensics, the phone is on, right? There are technologies called chip off, where you can basically like literally remove the chip from the phone, but that's destructive. So that's sort of a very last resort. But ideally, you would love to be able to connect to the phone and get a byte for byte copy of the phone itself. This is significantly more difficult than if you were just doing it with the hard drive from a computer. And one of the challenges is, of course, that the phone itself is on. It's not at rest, not making changes or anything. You have different manufacturers. You have different types of security based on the manufacturer. Like if we're talking about Android, you deal with phones from different providers who've implemented different things in the operating system. Like everything just gets really complicated really fast. Versus you take a hard drive, you plug it into a write blocker, and you have software that can just copy the bytes off the hard disk. So my team was responsible for finding ways. Basically, our charter would be, regardless of whatever device we're dealing with, we want to make sure that we can get as much as possible off the device. As much as possible, in a perfect world, is a byte-for-byte copy, but that's not always possible. So for us, it was really about trying to come up with whatever mechanism we could to get the most. And if that meant we could find a way to get a byte-for-byte copy, we would do that. Oh man, there's so much traffic already. This is going to be an absolute disaster of a drive. Okay. So, that meant that we had to do a lot of research. So we'd have to go look at, a lot of the time, to get like root access to be able to get byte-for-byte copies of things, or even just to get onto the device, right? You have to think about like law enforcement investigators being able to access a device so that they can get information off of it. There's stories of people who were able to have warrants for phones, and they're driving back to their lab trying to keep the phone unlocked, right? So because once it's locked, they might be screwed. So trying to keep the phone powered on, unlocked, so that they can go get the information off of it. So we're trying to build tools that can help with that. And the reality is that we have to explore things like potentially exploits to get root access, like basically whatever we can try to do that we can explain forensically if we have to modify the phone. By the way, like the phone is on, right? So just by nature of the phone being on, it's being modified. Just how it is. It's literally running. So a lot of time spent doing research, but that meant, like, how do we know how long it's going to take, right? So it's the exact situation this person's writing about, right? You have some research, you have no idea how long something's going to take. How are you supposed to tell someone in an ETA? So I wanted to give you the framing first so that you know where I'm coming from when I go to talk about this. I've spent a large part of my career working in situations that have to do with some type of research. Okay, so at a high level, and when I was kind of scrolling through the Reddit thread, a lot of the suggestions are basically like, do your best effort to guess, right? That's all that anyone can ask for is best effort. And then like, you know, multiply it by some factor, change the time scale, whatever. Basically like pad your estimate. And I guess I don't disagree with that conceptually. Like basically you're doing your best effort to provide some type of approximation. Like I don't disagree with that concept, but I also don't know if it sets people up for success. And I mean, not only like the person doing the work, but like your manager, the product owner, your project manager, whoever who cares about the ETA. I think one of the most effective things that you can be doing here is just time boxing stuff, right? And the reason I want to talk about this is like, given the fact that we have to do research on something, right? There's something to be proven, something we're trying to explore. So we haven't figured out yet if there is value. That's the point of doing the research, right? You're trying to come up with some conclusion. So we can have a hypothesis, right? If we use my forensic example, the hypothesis is that we hypothesize, given some phone, that we can come up with a way to support getting data off of the phone. Now, in some cases, we might have a stronger hypothesis that we could get a byte-for-byte copy of the phone. In some cases, we would have less confidence, and our hypothesis would be like, we're hoping we can get anything off of the phone, okay? But there's a hypothesis. And given what the hypothesis is, it's very wordy. The hypothesis is, there's some value that's associated with that end state. Now, everything we do in software development, software engineering, is about pros and cons and trade-offs. And a very obvious one in this situation is that there is some perceived value that we could get if the experiment pans out a certain way, or the research pans out a certain way. But there's also this trade-off of time. So to give you an exaggerated example, if we said, hey, look, in the forensic case, we want to be able to support getting data off of this phone. Okay, being able to get the data off of the phone would have some value. And we're going, okay, well, for this type of phone, like what's the market share? Like how prevalent is this phone actually? Okay, so if it was like an iPhone like that, there's a lot of iPhones out there. If it's, a random Android brand that no one's ever heard of, and we've had one law enforcement agency ask us about it, might be lower value. Still, some value, but it's all going to be something that we want to be able to try and quantify. So if I said, hey, look, it's going to take one engineer 2 years to be able to even get some data off of here, off of the one device that's one agency's asked for, they might be like, well, no way. It's such a waste of time. And I'm giving you an exaggerated example to prove the point. It'd be a waste of time because in 2 years, that engineer might be able to deliver so much other work versus just being able to support getting something off of this phone. If we use an exaggeration the other way, hey, look, this engineer could take 1 month and we have a high degree of confidence that we can get every byte off of this iPhone, which is a lot more prevalent. Someone would say, hell yeah, go put that engineer on there for 1 month. If it takes you 4 months, if it takes you a year, it might be worth it. Because that's going to have such a big impact because that device is so prevalent. And we're hypothesizing that you would have all of the bytes off of the device. So when I'm thinking about this kind of thing, it's really about what is our hypothesis on this? But the reality is we don't actually know how long it's going to take. But in our minds, we might be able to come up with I just spat everywhere. Don't do that. We might be able to come up with an approximation for how much time we would be willing to spend on this. And that's where the time boxing comes into play. So for us, this worked really, really well because, I'm going to use air quotes here, we were agile. On our team, when I say we're agile, I mean not specifically the methodology kind of thing, not necessarily Kanban or Scrum or anything, but we literally just operated with a lot of agility. Very nimble, if you will. And for us, that meant that we would revisit priorities very frequently. So if we were to time box something and say, hey, look, we're gonna let someone focus on this for the next 2 months, okay? That's gonna be our time box. We understand that there's going to be a bunch of uncertainty we don't know here, but we think that if we could do this and it was going to take us 2 months, we would feel like that's a good trade. And then what might happen is that a couple weeks into it, we might have a different data point in that work to be able to say one way or another. A month in, we get 2 months in, sometimes there'd be situations where we're like, hey, look, we've made a lot of advancements here, but it's not done. And then because we have been evaluating our priorities as we go as a small team, it's like, well, if there isn't another priority that's come up and we feel like we're still making advancements here, like we're not done, but we also have a few more things to explore, we might say, well, hell yeah, keep going, right? We'll add a new time box. We'll give it another 2 weeks to see if we can kind of get that through that next plateau. But all of this is a conversation, like with me as the engineering manager, with the engineers on the team that are working on whatever the thing is, and with the product owner. So everyone has alignment on that. It's not just the engineer going, I don't know, it's going to take me however long. It's not just me as the engineering manager being like, I think that Bobby should work on this for another however long. It's not the product owner just dictating. It's all of us coming to an agreement and just having an open conversation about this stuff. So I think, some of the bias here is one of the reasons I feel like this worked really well for us is because we were constantly communicating and trying to get alignment. I feel like without that, some of these decisions would not be as easy to have. But time boxing for us was really, really valuable. And that way, we didn't have to force people to come up with an ETA. Now, to kind of circle back on why people ask for this stuff, or even I'm talking about time boxing, I'm not saying that people never, therefore no one ever asked for an ETA for status updates. We still did. We still had conversations about this stuff. But it was to assess if we were making forward progress and if we needed to reprioritize. Right? So, yeah, it might be, contrived example, we're on a 2-month time box and we're 2 weeks into it. And the product owner might be having a conversation with us in the stand-up, talking to one of the engineers and being like, hey, well, based on where you're at so far, what are you thinking? It's a 2-month time box. How are you feeling about that? Do you feel like you're making progress on that? Or do you feel like you basically, based on what you've seen, you haven't even started, right? There's been zero progress because everything that we could have been exploring is just roadblock instantly. So that conversation would happen. Maybe another 2 weeks go by. Another conversation happens, but we're just using it as a checkpoint, right? So one of the reasons that we use things like ETAs, at least from my experience, is less about trying to... There's literally nothing in front of me. This car needs to get the sensors changed. One of the reasons we ask for ETAs is not to enforce not to make people fearful of deadlines and stuff like that. It's to get conversations going. I'm not saying this is the same everywhere. So if you're like, Nick, that's not how we work and you're lying, I have no idea how you guys work. I'm just telling you what worked for us and why we did it. And I still do this today, right? When I ask for ETAs and I'm talking through stuff with engineers, I'm just trying to assess if people feel like they are on track for what we've discussed. And if not, for any reason, it could be because you're going faster. If you're on track or not, because I want to understand if we need to make adjustments. That's all. So in these situations, the way that I kind of think through this, if I'm having ETA conversations with people on my team, I'm just using it to be able to figure out let's pick another example. So I guess everything's about research in this context from the Reddit post. So we've made a claim about some ETA, right? And I don't even know if this example is going to make sense. Coming up with stuff on the fly is hard. Because everything I've been talking about is I've been saying I time box things. I'm kind of avoiding the ETA conversation that's set outright from the Reddit post. Okay, let's let's forget the time boxing for this example. We haven't time boxed anything. Someone said, you want me to go do this work and I have to research it? It's going to take me 2 months. So when we want to talk about ETAs of things, right? Like the first part is like that first ETA of 2 months. So I would go back to what they were saying, some points on the thread is like, if you just have to throw up an estimate, like I would say it's a best effort kind of thing. And I guess I've had conversations like this with engineers, right? The way that I frame this kind of thing, this is going to be even outside of research, by the way, just like for more open-ended tasks. I would say like, hey, like, what's your gut feel for this, right? Like, I'm not going to carve it in stone, and I will tell people like, I want to talk about this, not to make you feel like what you say, like I'm going to be chasing you down and make sure you deliver on that day. I want to hear what you have to say because I want to see how you're thinking through what work might have to be done, right? To give you an example, I've had conversations with engineers where we're speccing out some work for them to do, and say like, from your perspective, what's your ETA on being able to work through this? I've had someone come back to me and tell me like multiple months for something, and I'm going, hold on, like I'm not the one implementing it. I don't know the code, but based on what's being discussed, like I cannot comprehend a way that something would take multiple months here. I can't rationalize it. So that's not for me to go tell them, nope, sorry, wrong answer, you're wrong. All right, I asked them for an ETA because I want to understand how they're approaching it. So then we get into a conversation and say like, okay, well, in my head, maybe I was thinking it was a week of work, 2 weeks of work. They're saying months. So, okay, like walk me through what you're thinking. And I've uncovered things where it's like either testing, validation, spec, whatever, where people are allocating significant amount of time, and I'm going, nope, like we actually already have the answer to that, or no, we don't have to dedicate time to coming up with that, because in parallel, someone else, like we can have, kind of pull that data and get you what you need, right? We don't have to like serialize that work, and it's certainly not going to take that long either, because we have a dedicated resource that can do it. So, it's not that person was wrong in their estimate. It's like, it's just what they were factoring into that. So my meta point here is that like when I'm talking to engineers about ETAs for things, it's to really try and pick apart what's going on. And I'm not saying it has to end up being done by that date or else, because I also recognize that with software development, things change all of the time. So yeah, if you want to bake in some buffer for some uncertainty, like do that for sure, but call it out. Say, yeah, and I think like, I might need a couple of extra days here for some uncertainty that might come up based on these things that we haven't seen yet. Cool. And even if you like didn't account for something and it's taking longer than expected, I'm having checkpoints with you along the way, right? We're talking with the stakeholders to make sure that we're going, yep, we feel like we're on track. And if not, that's okay. Like, let's talk about it, because if we don't know that you're off track, we can't make adjustments. So again, I like ETAs for just like getting that common shared understanding. I think this person beside me is trying to like match my speed awkwardly. I don't have the 360 camera on. It's super awkward though. Especially because it's a Tesla. Anyway, but yeah, I guess if I'm starting things out with engineers and asking for ETAs, it's so kind of get a gut feel, right? Let's talk about what you think is involved here. Are we on the same page? Are we even talking about the same thing? And then go from there, right? We use, if the ETA is changing along the way, let's talk about why. There's going to be situations where, like, if there's a deadline where we have to get something in place, then we're talking about scope, right? So if we had a deadline that was 1 month out and we're 3 weeks into the thing and you're telling me, like, man, I'm not even halfway done, obviously by that point, hopefully we have a better idea, but it's like, okay, well, what can we do? Like, what scope do we have to cut back? Like, what's our damage control here? What's our mitigation strategy? Right? Because if the deadline's fixed, then the scope has to be adjusted. And if the scope is fixed, sorry, this Tesla is just like the absolute worst. This other car. If the scope is fixed and like we can't ship until we have all those pieces, then it's like, then we have to move the deadline. So like having the ETA and being able to revisit it, I think is actually very helpful. But I think there is this, I don't know, like people use ETAs in different ways, and I've just seen it be very ineffective, and people get fearful of it because then it's like this, you don't want to say a number that's used against you, which I totally get. Someone says, what's the ETA? And you say something, and then it's not that. Now you're in deep shit. Like, that's not how I want to operate. I don't want people to be fearful of that, because then they're never going to tell me they're never going to tell me what they're thinking. Right? Oh, that's going to take 6 months. Yep. It's a one-line change. It's going to take 6 months. Why? Oh, it's a number that I know for sure I can't possibly screw that up. Right? It's suddenly it's not a helpful conversation anymore. So I don't know, like that's how I use ETAs, but in particular around the research stuff, I can absolutely understand why people would be like, I just don't know. And that's why I think time boxing is actually very helpful. Like, let's go back and say, how much time would we be willing to allocate to this before it starts not being valuable? Another thing that I'd mention here too is, like, I find that the more, this is a generalization, but if you're in a space or like a domain for a longer period of time and you've seen enough stuff that's similar, you might start to have an idea. Right? It's kind of like forecasting based on prior experiences. I don't know the answer to this, but we've seen work that's kind of like this before. Seen a couple of examples. Here they are, and they took, this one was 3 months, this was 4 months. That other one was like super, super challenging. That was like 9 months of work. We had one that we thought was super tricky, but it was actually like the easiest one. It was only like 2 weeks. So overall, like, we have 2 outliers on either side. Maybe 3 months. Maybe 3 months is what I feel here. Right? And like, I've just tried to rationalize to you how I came up with that. And then we can have a conversation. Like, if you're like, well, that seems outrageous, these aren't even comparable. Okay, well, let's talk about things that are. Right? We don't have anything comparable. Okay, then we can't forecast that way. Let's time box it. So I don't know. It's I realize I'm like probably making it sound like it's oversimplified. I don't mean to trivialize it, but an ETA, in my opinion, is a tool. And when you start using this tool in a really weird, well, I shouldn't say a weird way, probably the way that most people expect it to work, I just don't think it's an effective tool. It's an estimate, right? And like, things change. So I think that's my thoughts on ETAs, especially around research tasks. You know, the big challenge there is it's unbounded. So scope it. That's the time box. I've said this in I'll wrap up this thought, but I said this in other videos when I talked about that team that I was on. There'd be times where we would do an experiment or research on something, and it would be time box, and we would reach the end of that, and we'd say, well, we don't have an answer. So but we've reached the end of the time box. Other priorities have come up. Okay, we'll park it, right? Record what we learned. And I wanted to share too that in situations like this, sometimes people feel like they failed. And I think that's maybe an important thing to bring up too, is when we're talking about research tasks, it's research, right? There's a lot of uncertainty. It's unbounded. I think that people have to be prepared in these situations that there could be an outcome where there isn't success, at least not traditionally, right? You might not arrive at a solution where you're like, hell yeah, that's the thing, we did it, or we know conclusively. You might arrive at a solution that's like, we don't have an option here. We don't have an option we feel good about based on the data. And what I wanted to kind of share here is that I know that from having teams that operate this way, that can become very demoralizing when you have people. Sorry, I have to yawn. I was holding it in. That can become very demoralizing when you have someone that's been doing a research task for a while and then doesn't have success, and then they're on another research task and it doesn't have success. And then they feel like they don't have momentum. But something that's important to realize is that when you're doing research tasks, you don't necessarily control what the outcome is going to be, right? If I said, you're tasked with finding a library that does X, Y, and Z, and it needs to have these performance characteristics, that's your research task. You might go do research and say, I've scoured the internet. I can't find anything that does that. Here's the tests that prove it. I've run the benchmarks. I've, tried to evaluate different criteria that we were looking for. There's simply nothing out there that does it. I may have given you constraints on something that the reality is there isn't something. But guess what? Doesn't mean that the overall effort was a failure. Maybe if we didn't time box it and you spent 2 years on it, maybe we could consider that a failure. Not a good use of time. But if we've time boxed it and you don't come up with, the answer, we've at least collected data. We've learned something. And I think a lot of the time people forget that when you're doing research, the shared learning that you can bring back to the team can be very helpful. Back to the forensic examples, plenty of situations on my team from before where we'd go back and revisit something after gaining other knowledge, and then we would have unblocked ourselves, right? So we didn't have all the knowledge we needed at one point, but by doing other things and revisiting, we break through barriers, and then we end up, landing things that are very impactful. So, just an example of the success can come in the learning. It doesn't have to be, absolutely attached to coming to a successful conclusion in the research, right? So I think it's important to remind people of that, because it can be very demotivating. We always want to come up with that, that awesome result at the end, but sometimes it's just not there. And I think that's it. as I pull into the driveway. We'll get parked here. Yeah, no 360 cam because it's been raining and crappy, but that's part of living out here, I guess. Okay, thanks, folks. I will see you next time. And just a reminder, if you want questions answered, leave them in the comments or message Dev Leader on social media, and I'll keep you anonymous. I'll see you next time. Take care.